Opposing Gloves here. Today we're going to be talking about Massive's oscillator and the second video in the Massive from the Ground Up tutorial series. So, oscillator, abbreviated OSC. Massive has 3 of them. There's oscillator 1, 2, and 3. Make sure your oscillator's turned on by making sure the button next to oscillator is blue. That's a universal thing in Massive. So, there's a few different parts. There's wave tables and your ability to scroll through them by clicking these arrows. And we're going to talk about this in more detail right now. There's your different bend modes. There's amp, which stands for amplifying, which amplifies your signal using an algorithm they have coded into their program. And so you could just basically call that volume if you want to be simple. There's intensity, which controls whatever you set on the bend mode, which we'll talk about. Wavetable position, which is relative to the wave table you selected, which is why it's WT, which we're also going to talk about. And then you have pitch, and that's another thing. This is going to get pretty intense. So to help us understand these things, I have a spectrogram. And what a spectrogram does is it shows us the overtone volume of the frequencies in a tone. That's a very complicated way of saying that, but if you say these are all the frequencies in that square wave, and you can see their velocities by how high they are, this is called the overtone series. So you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of tones in this what you would call a note. It's actually almost like chords on chords and what you would call a note. And the fundamental frequency, the one that you hear, or you would say it's this note, is the loudest one. And so what happens is you have a sine wave. We'll talk about these other graphs in a second. You probably already know a little bit about them. So if we had a sine wave, it's just one tone. And all sounds are actually just combinations of sine waves with varying velocities and intervals. So that's actually a power chord. I believe it's power chord 151 or maybe 141. I don't know. But when you're creating tones, that's what makes a clarinet sound like a clarinet. You have your fundamental tone, but it's the overtone series that gives it its texture and timbre and the way those overtones interact with each other. So when someone says they're changing the pitch, they may be referring to the fundamental tone, or they may be referring to the harmonic series, changing these pitches instead of the fundamental. So all of a sudden things just got crazy. This pitch knob controls the entire whole. And so what that means is it manipulates the waveform. So now we're going to talk about the oscilloscopes. So these oscilloscopes show, let me see if I can get it to freeze. There we go. These oscilloscopes show the peaks and the low values in the voltage on the waveform, or the amplitude. I believe it's amplitude. So basically all I need to know is that this is a sine wave when it's all smooth like this. And when we introduce additional sine waves, things start to look a little funky. There's actually specific overtones, additional sine waves at particular frequencies that have been added to cause it to change its shape. So if we were to go to something maybe like additive mix, all these extra little bumps and wiggles are sine waves at different velocities being introduced into the signal. And you can see the overtone signal right here, or the harmonic series, the overtone series. So that's what a waveform is. And there's a whole bunch of samples that make up a waveform. Like if you were to take one slice of a waveform, like one line, and that was your slice, and then take another slice. This is for digital audio. This is how digital audio works. This is going to be important. And you take these slices of your waveform, you can play them back at varying rates and speeds, which becomes important when we're going to talk about the bend modes. But let's stick to the wavetables. So we have all these different waveforms, and they're based on these harmonic series. Like this is a squaw wave. This is a squaw wave, a square wave, and it has its own harmonic series. When we morph between, as you can see, this is a square to a saw wave. You're just simply changing the overtone content. You're not changing the frequency of it, but you're changing the frequency of the content inside it. So if you were to look at this, the overtone, the tone wouldn't move, but the overtone content would. And there you have it. And I believe a square wave is every other harmonic in the standard harmonic series. I may be wrong. Maybe that's the saw wave, but I'm pretty sure we just saw it do it. Yeah, it'd be the square wave. So these wavetables are a whole bunch of pre-made waveforms, some that are just like crazy looking. Like this thing, which who knows what that is. And all it is just complicated overtone harmonic stuff. Harmonic frequencies. And you can scroll through these various ones. So these are wavetables because it's a whole bunch of waveforms that have been compiled into one thing. Like this is a square wave to a saw wave. These are additive mix. Like for example, if we were to go to additive octaves, it's just the octaves in the harmonic series. So if you were to move through the wavetable, which would scroll through the waveforms, you'd hear all the octaves get added. And if you were to scroll back, you'd hear it go back to normal. So that's what these are. Just a whole bunch of waveforms, and this lets you scroll through them. And some are crazy looking. And you can kind of tell what they are. Like you can sort of see the series that they used to create them. And they did a really good job at selecting a wide variety of options, because other plugins offer you to basically make whatever you want, giving you morphing capabilities, while they stuck with just giving you a bunch of preset tables. Serum offers incredible flexibility in this regard. But I think they did a phenomenal job. You just got to kind of experiment and see what the waveforms are and what they do so you can use them intelligently. So now we're going to talk about the intensity knob now that we've covered the wavetable. Actually, let's cover pitch real quick. So pitch is the amount of waveforms that happen in a second. So if you move the pitch up, more happen. And you see the spectrum content start to change because you're changing the fundamental frequency, and this particular pitch parameter alters the entire overtone series according to that. When it gets so slow that the oscillation happens but is really long, that's called an LFO, and it's often used as a controller signal to control other parameters over time. It's just that slow. So we're going to go back to 0. Double click to go back to 0, or use Alt drag to go back to 0. You also have very fine pitch changes. So if we were to, so those are useful if you want to create pitch movement. Maybe you're making a dubstep wobble, like let's say you have, I don't know if you know music theory, but there are 12. The reason we're doing 12, 24, that type of thing is because there are 12 steps in a scale, at least the Western scale, and it's based off that. So that's why 12 is part of the series. There's like mathematical implications too. But if you were to play something that's moving at a slightly faster frequency against something that's moving at a slower frequency, you get an interesting result. Because their phases, their peaks and their lows are canceling each other out, because some of this low is happening and some of this high is happening, and you get all these interesting implications. And there's different forms of this. It's called modulation, and that's actually what the modulation oscillator tab is sort of all about. But yeah, so that's what that is. So if you were to go to do very minor pitch changes, like just like 0.7, you get very unusual, just slow stuff. And if we were to play a chord, you start getting some pad sort of sounding things. So we'll talk more about that and when we start creating pad sounds and stuff like that. But that's what pitch is. And these boxes right here are able to link envelopes of various kinds and LFOs of various kinds and control that parameter using them, which we will talk at length again later. So that's what those parameters do. The same goes for all these knobs. Once you understand how these are sort of routed, you'll no longer need explanations. You'll like know what the possibilities would be. So now we're going to talk about the bend modes. This is where the oscilloscopes start becoming very important. So the first bend mode is called spectrum, and what a bend mode does is it changes. So as we talked about earlier, each slice is a sample of audio. And if we were to read back those samples at a constant rate, we'd get our sine wave. But if we were to change the rate and tell it to interpret it differently using an algorithm, we would get something else. So we're going to actually start with bend plus minus because, actually, you know what? We'll start with spectrum. So let's go to a square wave. So just change the wavetable position from sine square all the way over. You get your square wave. All the spectrum mode does is it's sort of like a filter, but it removes the harmonic content until all that's left is the fundamental. And since, as we discussed, all tones are sine waves, you will always get back to that fundamental tone. You'll always go back to a sine wave. So all the spectrum mode does is return it to a sine wave. And you can actually see the harmonics being introduced as you go up and up and up and up and go back. So very interesting individual and interesting visual, interesting individual. And that's what the spectrum mode does. If we were to do that on the additive octaves, there's all our octaves, and this will just simply take the octaves off. So in this particular waveform, it's not all that useful because that's what this does. So, all right, so that's what spectrum mode does. We can go back to our sine wave. Now this bend plus minus squeezes, as we talked about, reads the sample rate back at a different rate in a different way. So up and down is nominal, it does nothing. So we have our sine wave being read. All the samples are being read back at a consistent rate, generating our sine wave. But this, if we were to bend minus it, it actually reads them back at a different rate. And that's what creates this here shape. It actually moves it a little bit to the left, which is pretty much what you need to know for sound design. And then if you were to go bend plus, moves it to the right. And so now you know what bend plus and minus does. And if you're to do that on a more complicated waveform, it's just changing the way those things are read. And if you're to move through the wavetable position and move the way the samples are being read back and start morphing like that, it's really interesting. That's really cool. So you start getting some really cool sounds. So that's what the bend plus minus does. And then there's one more mode called Formants. You also have bend plus and bend minus, which are basically just exclusively bend plus and bend minus, which is why I picked bend plus minus to demonstrate this. Last mode is called Formant. Now it's special. So if you remember, we talked about that overtone series before. And as you can see, it's already kind of doing something because this is supposed to be a sine wave. But how you add additional harmonics in, but the pitch can change in just the harmonic values. So when you're changing pitch, it tends to change those values. It changes the amount of starts and stops that happen, not only in the fundamental pitch, but all the additional pitches. Well, what Formants does is it does that, but it keeps the starts of the, let me see, I want to say this right. It keeps the fundamental where it's at, but it also preserves all the overtone structures in the harmonics. It creates like harmonic structures in harmonic structures. Like if I turn it up, it'll become more obvious. So the starts and stops have been preserved here. And you could see the overtone structures happening inside itself, so that the actual pitch of the original harmonics are still intact of the overtone series. And if you look on the spectrogram, it looks like it's like the fundamental pitch is changing. I'm going to be real here. I don't totally know what I'm talking about on this one. I've read what I could about it, and this is like a crazy version because it's reading back the samples with this overtone and stuff changing. And they don't give you the algorithm on how they mapped it out mathematically. So I can only give it my best guess, but there's sort of a filter that's applied. But the main takeaway is the pitch remains consistent. The idea is with that information, you could do some really specific thing with formant change on pitch. And then the last knob on here is the amplifier, which is basically just the volume. It amplifies your signal technically, and that creates your volume. There's a slide right here for the routing options, which I will cover at a later date in a later video. And that's pretty much the oscillator tab. If you have any questions about this, drop them in the comments. I can make a follow-up video. I'm thinking about just adding videos to this series in decimal points, like oscillators 2.1 for like some specific feature or cool thing about it. And yeah, subscribe for more. If I got something wrong, I don't claim to be perfect, so please just let me know, and I'll be sure to correct myself as I continue to teach and explain. And have a blessed day. Also check out my music on composinggloves.com.